4 centuries of Turko-Shahi and Hindu-Shahi resistance, how Afghanistan's ancient inhabitants delayed the arrival of Islam. This essay examines why the arrival of Islam in Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan was delayed for 400 years. It focuses on the resistance led by the Turko-Shahi and Hindu-Shahi dynasties, the region's ancient rulers, and tells the story of their last stand against advancing forces. An imaginative act of historical recovery. Today, when we look at the map of South Asia, we see fixed borders. Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Iran. We see Muslims in Pakistan and Afghanistan, Hindus in India. We see provincial and linguistic boundaries shaping new identities in Pakistan. These identities feel permanent. India versus Pakistan, Afghanistan versus Pakistan, arch rivals. Yet here is a strange fact few people know. The people who lived in the lands now called Afghanistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, northwestern Pakistan, around 700 to 900 CE, were Buddhists, Hindus, Zoroastrians. They were the forgotten ancestors of the majority population of Afghanistan, Pakistan, who followed local cults whose names we have lost. They built monasteries, fire temples, shrines. Their kings bore names like Spalapati, Samantadeva, Bhimadeva, Jaipal. They ruled from capitals at Kabul and Hind near the Indus. Their coins show horsemen and bulls. Their inscriptions are in Sanskrit and Kushan script. These people had kingdoms, Turko-Shahis and Hindu-Shahis. The Turko-Shahi dynasty ruled Kabul and Gandhara from roughly the 7th to the 9th century CE. They were of Central Asian origin, likely descended from the Kushans or Ephthalites, White Huns, Turkic or Hunnic peoples who had ruled this region for centuries before the Arabs arrived. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, visiting Gandhara in 644 CE, met these Turko-Shahi kings. He described them as Buddhists, though Buddhism was already declining and Brahminical Hinduism was rising. The Turko-Shahis were the first line of resistance against the early Arab raids. They held Kabul when the first Arab governors of Sijistan sent expeditions eastward. They fought the Rutbil and Zunbil rulers of Zabulistan, who were themselves a related stock. The Turko-Shahis were not Muslim. They were not Arab. They were the heirs of the Kushan and Ephthalite empires that had ruled this region for half a millennium before Islam. The Turko-Shahis were overthrown or succeeded by the Hindu-Shahis around the time of the Saffarid capture of Kabul in 870 CE. According to al-Biruni, the last Turko-Shahi king was Lagaturman, whose Brahmin minister Kala took the throne. The Hindu-Shahis were, as their name suggests, Hindu. They worshipped Shiva and Vishnu. They built temples and patronized Brahmins. But they were not Indian in the modern sense. They ruled from Hind, near the Indus, and their kingdom stretched from Kabul to the Jhelum River. They held the Khyber Pass, the Kurram Valley, and the routes through Swat and Bajar. They were the last non-Muslim dynasty of any significance in the region, and they held out against Islam for nearly 4 centuries after the Prophet. Were the Turko-Shahis and Hindu-Shahis ancestors of today's Pashtuns? Not directly. They were ruling dynasties, not tribes. Their lineage was mixed: Kushan, Ephthalite, Turkic, Brahmin. But the people they ruled, the populations of the Sulayman Mountains, the Zermatt Valley, the Logar, Ningrahar, and the mountain passes between Kabul and the Indus, were increasingly identified by contemporary observers as Afghans. The Turko-Shahis and Hindu-Shahis were the political expression of a population that was tribal, mountainous, and resistant to outside control. That population, in the eyes of Arab and Persian chroniclers, was Afghan. The Khalaj mercenaries who served the Saffarids were directly ancestral to the Ghilzai Pashtuns. The Turkish knights, who repelled the first Arab raid to Lahore in 664, were Ephthalite remnants, and Caroe connects the Ephtalites to the Khalaj. So while the kings were not Pashtun, The people they led almost certainly were. The Pashtun tribes did not emerge from nowhere in the 16th century when Babur first mentions them. They were there, in the mountains, unnamed or called by other names, for centuries before. The Turko-Shahi and Hindu-Shahi kingdoms were the last great non-Muslim political structures under which these ancestors of the Pashtuns lived before the long conversion to Islam began. The great transition came with Mahmud of Ghazni. Mahmud, who reigned from 998 to 1030 CE, was a Turkish slave who founded the Ghaznavid dynasty. He is famous in South Asian memory for his raids into India, but for the people of Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan, he is the figure who finally broke the back of the Hindu-Shahi kingdom. Between 1001 and 1026 CE, Mahmud marched into Gandhara repeatedly. He defeated Jaipal and Anandapal, the last great Hindu-Shahi kings. He sacked Waihind, the capital near the Indus. By 1021 CE, the Hindu-Shahi dynasty was extinct. Al-Biruni, who lived through these events and may have met Jaipal, wrote their epitaph with grudging admiration. This Hindu-Shahi dynasty is now extinct. We must say that in all their grandeur they never slackened in the ardent desire of doing that which is good and right, that they were men of noble sentiment and noble bearing. With the defeat of the Hindu-Shahis, the political resistance to Muslim rule in Gandhara ended. The Peshawar Valley, the plains along the Indus, the routes through the Khyber came under sustained Muslim control for the first time, and around this time the slow conversion of the population began. It was not instantaneous. Caroe notes that even 400 years after the Prophet, the Afghans were not by any means all of the Muslim faith. Al-Biruni, writing around 1000 CE, calls the Afghan tribes Hindus. The Hudud al-Alam, written in 982 CE, distinguishes between Muslims and Afghans. Conversion was gradual, uneven, and often pragmatic. Tribes converted to gain alliance with Muslim powers, or to escape taxation, or because their chiefs saw advantage in the new faith. Some converted, then reverted. Some adopted Islam only in name while maintaining old customs. It took centuries for the mass of the population to enter the Muslim fold. But as the centuries passed, the identity of the region transformed. Buddhism vanished entirely from the lowlands, surviving only in remote valleys like Swat and Gilgit for a few more centuries. Hinduism retreated across the Indus, becoming the religion of India rather than of the frontier. Zoroastrianism, once the faith of the Sasanian Empire, survived only among the Parsis of Gujarat, and Islam became the dominant faith of Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan. Alongside this religious transformation, ethnic identities also crystallized. The Pashtun tribes, who had existed for centuries as a loose collection of mountain peoples, began to develop a shared identity, a shared language, Pashto, and a shared code of honor, Pashtunwali. By the time of Babur in the early 16th century, the names of the Pashtun tribes, Yusufzai, Khalil, Momand, Afridi, Orakzai, and many others, appear clearly in the historical record, occupying the same territories they hold today. The long journey from the Buddhist monks of Gandhara to the Muslim Pashtuns of the Khyber Pass had taken nearly 1,000 years. This ancient land once echoed with the chanting of Buddhist sutras and the hymns of Hindu priests. The same mountains that today shelter Pashtun tribes once sheltered the armies of the Turko-Shahi and Hindu-Shahi kings. To recover this past is not to undermine present faith. It is to understand the long, slow, complex journey that brought us to where we are. It is to recognize that identity is not fixed. It flows, it changes, and it takes centuries. This essay is an imaginative act of resurrection. It asks, what if we could walk through Gandhara in the year 700 CE, or 800 CE, or 900 CE? What would we see? We would see a world where Islam had not yet arrived, We would see Buddhist monks and Hindu Brahmins. We would see Turko-Shahi kings with their Central Asian faces and Kushan heritage. We would see Hindu-Shahi kings with their Brahmin ministers and their coins bearing horsemen and bulls. We would see kings who worshipped Shiva and warriors who followed the Buddha. And we would see in the mountains the ancestors of today's Pashtuns, unconverted, untamed, impatient of control. We would see the slow, grinding pressure of Arab raids, then Saffarid campaigns, then Ghaznavid conquests. We would see the final defeat of the Hindu-Shahis and the long, gradual conversion of a people. We would see the old world dying and the new world being born. This is not a fantasy. This is the history that lies beneath our feet, waiting to be unearthed. 400 years at the gate, the delayed arrival of Islam in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the last stand of the Hindu-Shahis, a scholarly essay based on Olaf Caroe's The Pathans, chapters 7 and 8. The image of early Islamic conquest is one of breathtaking speed. Within a single century of the Prophet Muhammad's death, Arab armies had swept from the Arabian Peninsula across Persia, through the Levant, and along North Africa to the Atlantic. Popular imagination often assumes that the regions of modern Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan fell just as swiftly. Olaf Caroe, in chapters 7 and 8 of his masterwork, The Pathans, demolishes this assumption. Drawing on Arab chronicles, Persian histories like Tarikh-i-Sistan, the eyewitness accounts of the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, the encyclopedic writings of Biruni, and the silent testimony of coins and inscriptions, Caroe demonstrates that the arrival of effective Muslim political control and religious conversion in the lands east of the Helmand River was delayed by nearly 4 centuries. This essay traces that long process, compares historical regions with their modern names, examines the remarkable resistance of the Turko-Shahi and Hindu-Shahi dynasties, addresses the question of whether these resistant peoples were ancestors of today's Pashtuns, and follows the narrative to Mahmud of Ghazni, where the historical mists finally begin to clear. The pre-Islamic foundation, a millennial Iranian world. To understand why Islam took so long, one must first understand what stood in its way. Caroe insists that the region between the Oxus and the Indus had been part of the Persian cultural and political world for over 1,000 years before the first Arab raids. From the Achaemenians, 6th to 4th centuries BCE, through the Parthians and Sasanians, 3rd to 7th centuries CE, and even under nomadic invaders like the Ephthalites or White Huns, Iranian influence remained paramount. The Sasanian kings, particularly Khusrau Anushirvan, 531 to 579 CE, and Khusrau II, 590 to 628 CE, had repeatedly reasserted Persian sway over the frontier, treating it as the eastern outpost of their empire. Caroe calls this longevity an historical fact of the deepest significance. When Islam finally arrived, it did not enter a vacuum. Instead, it passed through a Persian prism. The new faith was filtered, shaped, and subtly resisted by a culture far older than itself. The Iranian spirit, still evident around Peshawar today, did not yield quickly to Arab conquerors. Conversion required not merely defeating armies, but overwriting a millennial civilizational identity. This was a task far beyond the demographic or cultural resources of the early Arab raiding parties, who numbered in hundreds or thousands, not the tens of thousands required for sustained occupation. The geography of delay, 2 axes that missed the target. Closely related to cultural resilience was geography. Caroe meticulously traces 2 primary axes of Arab expansion from Persia, neither of which directly penetrated the central highlands of modern Afghanistan or the Kabul-Gandhara region for centuries. The first, more celebrated axis ran from Fars, southwestern Iran, today's Fars province, through Nishapur, in northeastern Iran, near the modern city of the same name, to Herat, today a major city in western Afghanistan, Merv in modern Turkmenistan near Mary, and Balkh in northern Afghanistan near modern Mazar-e Sharif, ultimately reaching Transoxiana, the land beyond the Oxus River, encompassing modern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and parts of Turkmenistan. But Caroe is emphatic that this northern route never reached south of the main wall of the Hindu Kush. Kabul and the central Afghan Massif, today called the Hazarajat, the mountainous heartland of Afghanistan dominated by the Hindu Kush, remained untouched by it. The second axis through Sijistan, modern Sistan, a region straddling the border of present-day Iran and Afghanistan centered on the Helmand River Delta, to Bust, near modern Lashkargah in Helmand province, and Zamindawar, the fertile valley north of Bust, today part of Helmand and Kandahar provinces, came closer but still resulted in only ephemeral raids. While Arab governors could temporarily menace the Helmand Valley, they could not hold territory east of it. The mountain massifs of Ghor, today the central highlands of Afghanistan, a notoriously impenetrable region, and the Hazarajat acted as a formidable barrier, allowing indigenous non-Muslim rulers to maintain de facto independence. The Arabs conquered the Persian lowlands and the Oxus plains, but bypassed the very sanctuaries where Hindu and Buddhist kings would continue to rule for centuries. When raiding parties did push further, they reached places like Bana, modern Banu, a district in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Pakistan, located directly between Multan and Kabul in a fertile plain below the Sulayman Mountains, and Alawar, almost certainly the site near the modern village of Lahore, 4 miles inland from the Indus at the Hund Ford in the Yusufzai Samar of the Peshawar Valley. These raids, notably the 664 CE expedition that encountered 18 Turkish knights, were spectacular but temporary. They left no permanent Muslim presence. The indigenous resistors, Rutbil, Zunbil, and the Shahs of Kabul. Those indigenous rulers were not passive victims. Caroe presents them as organised, militarily capable, and remarkably resilient. 2 dynasties dominate the account of Chapter 7, the mysterious Rutbil, or Zunbil, and the Kabul Shahs. The Rutbil, ruling over Zabulistan, a region corresponding roughly to the area around modern Ghazni and extending south and west toward Kandahar, and sometimes Arukaj, the classical Arachosia, covering approximately the modern province of Kandahar, is described by Caroe as clearly an unbeliever who remains unsubdued despite temporary Arab successes. In 685 CE, a Rutbil was strong enough to confine the Arab governor to the citadel of Zaranj, near modern Nad Ali, in the Helmand Delta of Afghanistan. In 698 CE, an Arab governor named Obidallah attacked Kabul only to meet disaster and his death. Even when the Umayyad viceroy al-Hajjaj demanded the head of a rebel who had taken refuge with the Rutbil executed the man, not out of submission, but as a negotiated concession. Caroe notes that the Muslim chroniclers consistently refer to these opponents as Turks or Haytal, Hephthalites, and he finds good grounds for connecting the Haytal with the Khalaj, the Khalaj being the ancestral group of the Galji or Ghilzai Pashtuns, one of the 2 great Pashtun confederacies. This is the first hint that the resistant peoples of the mountains may be directly related to modern Pashtuns. The Kabul Shahs are even more significant for the long delay. These rulers, sometimes called the Turko-Shahi line and later the Hindu-Shahi line, governed from Kabul and later from Waihind in Gandhara. Caroe notes that they remained undisturbed for the entire first 2 Islamic centuries, roughly 622 to 822 CE. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang visited Gandhara in 644 CE, just 2 years after the decisive Arab victory over Sasanian Persia at Nihawand, south of modern Hamadan in Iran, and made no mention whatsoever of any Muslim presence or any new wind. Buddhism was waning and Brahmanism rising, but Islam was simply not a factor. This silence from an external, neutral observer is among the most damning pieces of evidence against any theory of rapid conquest. When Kabul finally fell to the Saffarids, an Iranian dynasty from Sijistan, in 870 CE, the Shahs did not vanish. They moved their capital to Waihind in Gandhara, a site Caroe identifies with great plausibility as the area near the present village of Lahore, close to the Indus, not far from the modern town of Hund in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Pakistan. Here they continued as the Hindu-Shahi dynasty, ruling over the Peshawar Valley and the surrounding region for another century and a half. The Hindu-Shahis, 4 centuries of resistance. The Hindu-Shahi dynasty is the centerpiece of the long delay. Caroe, drawing on al-Biruni's Tariq al-Hind, History of India, written in the early 11th century, provides their lineage. According to al-Biruni, the last Turki-Shahi king was Lagaturman, whose Brahmin minister, Kala, having discovered hidden treasures that gave him wealth and influence, imprisoned the king and, finding ruling sweet, his riches enabled him to carry out his plans, and so he occupied the royal throne. After Kala ruled a line of Brahmin kings, Samand, Kamalu, Bhim, Jaipal, Anandapal, and Tarajanapal. The last was killed in 1021 CE, and his son Bhimpala 5 years later. Al-Biruni, despite being a Muslim writing for a Muslim audience, praises these kings with genuine admiration. In all their grandeur, they never slackened in the ardent desire of doing that which is good and right, that they were men of noble sentiment and noble bearing. Caroe emphasizes the chronology. The Hindu-Shahi dynasty maintained a non-Muslim kingdom in Gandhara from the late 9th century until the early 11th, roughly 150 years after the Saffarid capture of Kabul. But if one counts from the first Arab raids of the 660s CE to the final defeat of the Hindu-Shahis in the 1020s, nearly 400 years passed during which indigenous non-Muslim rulers kept Muslim forces at bay. Caroe is explicit. The fact that these kings were able to maintain great splendour and dignity in the Peshawar Valley until the opening decade of the 11th century, 400 years after the Hijrat, sufficiently disposes of the uncritical tradition that Islam came early to these parts. The evidence for their rule extends beyond al-Biruni's text. Coins found mostly in the Peshawar Valley and around the site of Waihind bear the names of these kings in Nagari, Hindu script, often with a cushion cursive script on the reverse. The typical types show an armed horseman on the obverse and a seated bull on the reverse. An inscription discovered at Birkot in Swat, in northern Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Pakistan, begins with the words, "In the reign of the Supreme Sovereign Superior, King of Great Kings and Supreme Lord, Sri Jayapala. This proves that Jaipal, the most famous of the Hindu Shahi kings, ruled directly over Swat. Caroe notes that the Hindu Shahis held Ningrahar, modern Nangarhar province, Afghanistan, around Jalalabad, west of the Khyber Pass, and Logar, modern Logar province, Afghanistan, south of Kabul, where they seem to have been crowned. They and their officials must have been intimately acquainted with all the routes and the tribes on them, between Kabul and Peshawar, whether direct by the Khyber, by the southern Kurram route, or by the northern route by way of Kuna, Bajor, Talash and Swat. Were these resistors ancestors of the Pashtuns? This is a central question, and Caroe handles it with careful precision. The peoples who resisted the Arabs and the Saffarids are referred to in the sources by various names: Turks, Haytal, Hephthalites/White Huns, Kalaj, and, by the time of al-Biruni, circa 1000 CE, Afghans. Caroe traces the earliest references. A 3rd century Sasanian inscription mentions Afghan, a term almost certainly referring to Afghan peoples. The Indian astronomer Varaha Mihira, writing in the 6th century, mentions Afghans within India. Xuanzang, 629 to 645 CE, mentions a people called Apo Kien in the northern part of the Sulayman Mountains, the long mountain range running from central Afghanistan into Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Pakistan. Caroe states flatly that these can be no other than Afghans. The Hudud al-Alam, a geography written in 982 CE, speaks of a village named Saul near Gardeh, in modern Paktia province, Afghanistan, near the Zermatt Valley, as inhabited by Afghans. It also describes the region of Ninha, Ningrahar/Nangarhar, as a place where the king makes a show of conversion to Islam, but has over 30 Muslim, Afghan and Hindu wives. Caroe points out that the distinction between Muslim and Afghan in this passage is not without significance. It implies that at this late date, being Afghan was not synonymous with being Muslim. Al-Biruni, writing around 1000 CE, states, "In the mountains to the west of India, there live various tribes of the Afghans, which extend up to the neighbourhood of the valley of the Sind, Indus." In an earlier passage, he calls these tribes rebellious, savage races occupying the frontiers of India towards the west, and notably, he designates them as Hindus, meaning they were not yet converted to Islam. Caroe concludes, "It will be seen that the Afghan tribes are by this time established just where they are today, east of Kabul, and in the mountains as far as the Indus. They are not yet converted, and they are impatient of control." The connection between the resistant Shahi kingdoms and the Pashtun tribes is not one of direct political continuity. The Shahis were a ruling dynasty, not a tribal confederacy. But the population over whom they ruled, the people of the mountains and the Sulayman range, were increasingly identified in the sources as Afghans. The mercenaries whom the Saffarids enlisted from the Ghazni region were called Khalji, a name directly linked to the Galji or Ghilzai Pashtuns, one of the two great Pashtun confederations. Caroe is cautious but suggestive. The Rutbil of the Arab chronicles, with his Turkish/Haitol connections and his power in Zabulistan and Arukaj, may well be a forerunner of Mirwais, leader of the great Galji confederacy of the 18th century. Without claiming direct descent, Caroe makes clear that the human stock that resisted Arab and Saffarid expansion was the same stock that would later be called Pashtun. The 400 years of resistance were not the achievement of a foreign ruling class alone. They were rooted in the stubborn, mountainous, tribal populations that the Shahis led but did not create. Internal divisions of the caliphates, the strategic vacuum. The resistance of the Hindu-Shahis would have been impossible without the internal chaos that consumed the early caliphates. Caroe documents this chaos extensively in Chapter 7. Following the murder of Caliph Uthman, 656 CE, civil wars associated with Ali's caliphate diverted resources from the eastern frontier. Between 680 and 691 CE, a 10-year struggle between rival governors in Khorasan, the vast northeastern province of the Sasanian and early Islamic empires, covering much of modern Iran, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan, paralysed the province. From roughly 685 to 705 CE, a three-cornered conflict pitted the Umayyads of Damascus against the Zubarids of Arabia and Iraq and the Kharijites, Quranic fundamentalists and rebels, of the Persian Gulf. Caroe concludes that even the great Caliph Abd al-Malik, 685 to 705 CE, was so consumed with maintaining his dynasty against rival claimants that he could not mount any planned extension of Muslim domination beyond Sijistan to the east. The Abbasids who followed, from 750 CE, were no more successful in this direction than their Umayyad predecessors, if anything less so. Under Al-Mamun, 813 CE, the caliphate could only extend postal services to Kabul, not military control. The Kharijite rebellion in Sijistan, led by Hamza, reached its climax in 797 CE when Hamza not only drove the Caliph's forces into the garrison cities, but declared the abolition of tribute and land revenue and put to death Abbasid revenue agents. The Tariq-i-Sistan records an authentic exchange of letters between Caliph Harun al-Rashid and Hamza, in which the rebel quotes the Kharijite slogan, La hukma illa lillah, there is no order but of God. The same source notes that Hamza founded the town of Gardeh, today the capital of Paktia province in Afghanistan, near the Zermatt Valley, and not far from Khost and Kurram. Caroe remarks that Kharijite connections with this part of the Pathan country may help to explain certain religious deviations from orthodoxy, which we shall later have occasion to notice in the Tourists and other Kalanri Pathan tribes in that neighbourhood. The Tourists, a Pashtun tribe of the Kurram Valley, are indeed Shia, a minority in overwhelmingly Sunni Pashtun regions, and Caroe hints that Kharijite influence may have contributed to this distinctiveness. The strategic implication is clear. The very period during which the caliphates might have consolidated their gains east of the Helmand was consumed by internal rebellion, succession crises, and sectarian warfare. The Hindu-Shahis did not defeat a unified, focused enemy. They survived because the Muslim world was too busy fighting itself. The Saffarid interruption. Iranians, not Arabs. Chapter 8 introduces a turning point. By the end of the second Islamic century, circa 800 CE, Caroe writes, the strength of the Arab thrust towards the east was spent. Spiritually, the appeal of Islam continued to spread. But in the east, the Arab as conqueror had shot his bolt. From now on, the sword and the Quran were to be entrusted to other hands. Those other hands belonged to the Saffarids of Sijistan, an Iranian dynasty. Yaqub Ilais, the Saffar, the coppersmith, was born in a village in Sijistan, served an apprenticeship in his trade, took to the roads as a highwayman, and eventually became commander of the army. In 861 CE he was proclaimed Emir of Sijistan. Caroe emphasizes that Yaqub was unmistakably Iranian. On a convivial occasion after a victory, an Arabic poem was read to him. Yaqub protested, "What is the use of reciting something he could not understand?" His secretary then recited in Persian. The Tariq-i-Sistan records, this was the first time after the Arab conquest that poems were recited in Persian among Persians since the days when the Persians had intoned after the manner of the Sasanians. Yaqub campaigned successfully against the Kharijites, against Herat, and, crucially for this narrative, against the Rutbil and the Shah of Kabul. The Tariq informs us that during this campaign, Yaqub founded the city of Ghazni, in modern Ghazni province, Afghanistan, on the main route from Kabul to Kandahar. In 870 CE, he captured Kabul. He sent as presents to the Caliph in Baghdad an idol he had taken from the great temple there, along with other trophies from Bamiyan, the famous Buddha statue site in central Afghanistan. For the first time, the northern and southern axes of advance were joined, and not by an Arab, but by an Iranian. For the first time, Kabul was fairly reduced and held by Muslim arms. For the first time, the Ghazni area was brought under administration and a city built. For the first time, the Khalji were successfully brought under subjection and enlisted in Yaqub's armies as mercenaries. One of them, named Subkari, held high military command in Persia. Yaqub's capture of Kabul in 870 must have been the event that caused the Shahi Kings to shift their capital to Waihind on the Indus. But Yaqub's ambitions turned westward. In 875, he marched on Baghdad, nearly succeeded, was defeated, and died in 879. His brother Amr continued the dynasty but could not consolidate the eastern conquests. The Hindu-Shahis seem to have recovered Kabul and certainly held Ningrahar and Logar. When Amr was defeated and captured by the Samanids, another Iranian dynasty ruling north of the Hindu Kush, in 900 and sent in chains to Baghdad, the Saffarid grip on the east loosened. The region of Ghazni came under loose and uncertain Samanid control, Caroe is generous in his assessment of Yaqub. The career of Yaqub Lais is notable as that of the first Muslim ruler to make the power of Islam effectively felt on the eastern frontier. He is also probably the first to have enlisted Afghan tribesmen on a large scale in his army, made up mainly of Khalji and others from the region around Ghazni. But the essential fact remains: even after Yaqub, the Hindu Shahis continued to rule in Gandhara. The mists have not yet cleared. The Last Stand, Jaipal, Anandapal, and the Coming of Mahmud. The mists begin to clear with the rise of the Ghaznavids. Zabulistan, a Turkish slave who rose to become governor of Ghazni under the Samanids, founded the Ghaznavid dynasty. His son, Mahmud of Ghazni, reigned 998 to 1030 CE, is the figure who finally brings the centuries of delay to an end. It is in the conflicts between Mahmud and the Hindu Shahi Kings, Jaipal and Anandapal, that Caroe's narrative acquires names, dates, and battles that can be followed with confidence. Jaipal, the most famous of the Hindu Shahi Kings, fifth in al-Biruni's list, ruled over Gandhara from his capital at Waihind, Lahore near Hund. Al-Biruni may have met him. He fought multiple battles against Zabulistan and Mahmud. The details are sparse in Caroe's chapters, but the outcome is clear. Jaipal was defeated. According to al-Biruni, the Hindu-Shahi dynasty ended with Tarayanapala, killed in 1021 CE, and his son Bimpala 5 years later. Caroe quotes al-Biruni's epitaph: "This Hindu-Shahi dynasty is now extinct, and of the whole house there is no longer the slightest remnant in existence. We must say that in all their grandeur they never slackened in the ardent desire of doing that which is good and right, that they were men of noble sentiment and noble bearing. With the defeat of the Hindu Shahis, the long resistance ended. Gandhara, the Peshawar Valley, the plains along the Indus, the routes through the Khyber came under sustained Muslim political control for the first time. The year was approximately 1021 CE, or 412 AH. 400 years had passed since the Prophet's death in 632 CE. 400 years of Arab raids, Persian Saffarid campaigns, Kharijite rebellions, Abbasid neglect, and Hindu Shahi resilience had finally concluded. The clearing mists. What emerges? With Mahmud of Ghazni, the historical record transforms. Caroe notes, "For the first time for nearly 1,500 years, we are granted a glimpse of the people behind the trappings of the dynastic annals." Al-Biruni, writing in the early 11th century, describes the Afghans as established in the mountains east of Kabul as far as the Indus. He calls them rebellious savage races and, crucially, Hindus, unconverted. The Hudud al-Alam, 982 CE, distinguishes between Muslims and Afghans. Al-Utbi, Mahmud's historian, speaks of Afghans as included in Mahmud's army. Masud, Mahmud's son, sent his son into the hills near Ghazni to subdue Afghans. The name Pakhtun or Pashtun does not yet appear. Caroe notes that we must wait several more centuries for that, until Babur in the early 16th century. But the people are unmistakably present. Caroe sums up, "At least from al-Biruni, we know that by the time of the early Ghaznavids, the Afghans have appeared upon the stage, in the very regions where they now dwell." The question posed earlier, can the 4 centuries of resistance be attributed to ancestors of today's Pashtuns, can now be answered with nuance. The ruling dynasties, the Turko-Shahis and Hindu-Shahis, were not themselves Pashtun in any tribal sense. They were a mixed line with Kushan, Epthalite, and Brahmin elements. But the populations they governed, the peoples of the Sulayman Mountains, the Zermatt Valley, the Logar, Ningrahar, and the mountain passes between Kabul and the Indus, were increasingly identified by contemporary observers as Afghan. The Khalaj mercenaries enlisted by Yaqub Lais were directly ancestral to the Ghilzai Pashtuns. The Kharijite strongholds in Gardeh and the Zermatt Valley left their mark on Pashtun tribes like the Turis. The 18 Turkish knights who repelled the first Arab raid to Lahore in 664 were Ephthalite, Haytal remnants, and Caroe explicitly connects the Haytal to the Kalaj. The chain of connection, while not direct political descent, is substantial enough to assert that the human resistance to Muslim conquest, the stubborn, mountainous tribal refusal to yield, was indeed the work of the ancestors of today's Pashtuns. They did not convert quickly. They did not surrender their mountains. They fought, retreated, regrouped, and fought again for 400 years until Mahmud of Ghazni's superior force finally broke the Hindu-Shahi kingdom. But even then, as Caroe notes, the Afghans are not by any means all of the Muslim faith 400 years after the Prophet. Conclusion: a sobering corrective. The long delay of Islam in Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan was not an accident. It was the product of a millennial Iranian culture that resisted cultural erasure, of a geography that allowed mountain sanctuaries to remain untouched, of formidable indigenous dynasties like the Rutbil and the Hindu-Shahis who defeated Arab armies and outlasted caliphs, of internal civil wars within the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates that drained energy away from the eastern frontier, and of a historiographical silence from the Hindu side that allowed Arab chronicles to exaggerate their own successes. The Turko-Shahis and Hindu-Shahis held the line for nearly 4 centuries, moving their capital from Kabul to Waihind, fighting on even after defeat, and earning the grudging admiration of a Muslim scholar like al-Biruni. The peoples they ruled, the ancestors of today's Pashtuns, remained largely unconverted until the Ghaznavid period and beyond. The mists clear only with Mahmud of Ghazni in the early 11th century, 4 centuries after the Prophet. Caroe's final remark in chapter 7 is worth repeating as the last word on this subject. It is seldom the earliest converts who are the most devoted to a faith. The Pashtuns came late to Islam, but when they came with the same intensity and stubbornness that had kept the armies of the caliphs at bay for 400 years.